Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Welcome to the show. Lizzy, the UK government wants to tell a positive story about trade. And here today we have a trade relationship that Britain's been developing in the past 5 years, one that's brought in already billions of pounds to the UK economy. It's not a country in the EU, so it's a post-Brexit success.
Hooray!
But it is also an issue because it is Saudi Arabia. It's ranked by Freedom House as one of the 16 countries with the worst of the worst line in terms of political rights and civil liberties. So it's a relationship that could be immensely beneficial and yet is also problematic.
Yeah, look, the headlines in the UK press are about reports of lethal force being used to clear the way for Saudi's sweeping project, building the new city of Neom. And yet we've got Oliver Dowden, Kemi Badenoch, and the largest group of business executives in a decade, 450 of them, in Riyadh for a joint summit. So what does the UK get out of this relationship? What does it lose? And is it all just meaningless backslapping and photo opportunities? Let's put it in perspective. We've got our Saudi Arabia Bureau Chief, Christine Burke, joining us live from the summit. Christine, Riyadh's government's really playing an increasingly pivotal role in the world of finance, geopolitics, culture. Just walk us through how that came about.
Well, look, I think this all stems from when MBS, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, really stepped into power and created what is known as the Vision 2030 agenda. This entails Saudi Arabia investing heavily in a multitude of industries. It wants to become a hub for tourism. It wants to become a hub for manufacturing. It has been investing in sports globally. It has also been acquiring stakes in major companies across the world. And I think that has raised the profile of Saudi Arabia. Simply, the government and the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which now has almost $1 trillion in assets, has just become a force that cannot be ignored when it comes from when it comes to a lot of the key areas that you mentioned. And the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has also proven to be somewhat of a steady hand as of late in geopolitical relations when it comes to the Middle East. You know, he's been said to be in talks over normalizing relations with Israel. He has reestablished diplomatic relations with Iran. And so, again, Saudi Arabia just really emerging in the last 5 years or so as a powerhouse that cannot be ignored, from finance to entertainment to sports to politics to geopolitics.
Yeah, absolutely. I was amazed to read, Christine, that Saudi Arabia wants to double the annual number of tourists that visit by 2030. This is to 150 million people. I think very few Brits, actually, I know very few Brits will ever have been to Saudi Arabia. How important do you think this summit is? I mean, who is there? I mean, just getting that number of people actually to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, you know, the UK is touting it as a huge success so far, just given the large number of delegates that are here. I mean, we do have the delegation being led by the Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden. There are 5 other UK ministers here. There are a number of Saudi ministers that have also been speaking from the stage this morning. And it's clear when you kind of look at what's going on here that the UK wanted to bring British companies to Saudi Arabia to show them, hey, look, here's the scope of work that you could win by having your foot in the door in Saudi Arabia. And then on the flip side of that, I think, you know, Saudi Arabia is looking at it as, well, here are all these business delegates coming that may eventually want to invest in the kingdom, do more business here. It was clear from the Saudi side this morning when we heard from Khaled Al-Fallah, the Minister of Investments, that they are looking for UK companies to come here to establish regional headquarters, to apply for licenses to invest in the kingdom. And then at the same time, I think it's clear from the UK side that what they want is these British companies to come in and try and win some of the work that's going on here. You know, an example that was made by the Deputy Prime Minister was hotel operators and hotel designers that are in the UK coming and offering their expertise to all of the industry and companies that need it here in the kingdom.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm also remembering back to last year when there were Saudi officials at the UK AI summit at Bletchley Park, which we covered here on the UK Politics podcast. And Saudi being interested in that space, I wonder whether it's actually developing its own artificial intelligence capabilities.
Well, it seems a bit early days. We do know that Saudi Arabia is, of course, interested in AI. And again, going back to comments that were made on the stage this morning, AI was definitely touted as one of the key industries that Saudi Arabia and the UK are looking at kind of developing together. Healthcare was another one, education, tourism, culture. These were all things, but there was a heavy emphasis on AI. I think at this point, I just question really what Saudi has to bring to the table, aside from what it often brings, which is the oil wealth, the money, the power of the pocket, if you will. Saudi Arabia did create a new investment fund earlier this year, backed by 100 billion in capital from the Public Investment Fund. It is not specifically meant to be a fund that is, or a firm that is investing in AI. However, its goal is really to build out completely new manufacturing centers in Saudi Arabia that are powered by AI. So again, a little bit too early to tell, but this is being highlighted as a space that these two countries are interested in working together in.
For any students of sort of political history, they'll also understand that we're in this kind of post-Kissinger era, aren't we? That there was a notion that doing trade and business with certain countries would end up meaning that they became more liberalised. And we're post that with Russia, with China. And so this kind of also leads me to the other main question about Saudi Arabia, that it is still one of the least free countries in the world. If you look at a lot of the kind of human rights organisations and how they rank them, and they're accused of a lot of very significant human rights abuses. Saudi Arabia defends itself against a lot of those accusations and points to its recent reforms. But what does that sort of tension mean for business and for politics? As you say, you've got a lot of UK politicians visiting now.
I mean, look, Caroline, I think the bottom line is that it makes things tricky. It just means that it's at this stage, it's still always a part of the conversation. I think, we would be naive to think that there are not these that there are business conversations happening that don't include an element of the concerns that you're talking about. Saudi Arabia, for its part, has tried to get out there and its message to the people is often, hey, look, come to Saudi Arabia, come and see for yourself. At the same time, though, we continue to see reports that suggest human rights violations are still happening. So I think it's a really tricky line to toe. I'm actually going to be speaking to Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden a bit later today. And one of the questions I plan to ask him is, how is he balancing this? He's here in Riyadh at a kind of interesting time, as you said, given all the reports in UK media. So it'll be interesting to see what he has to say, because surely it's something to be considered, especially as we're in an election year.
And while you're there in Riyadh, some of our other colleagues are in Doha for the Qatar Economic Forum, which is powered by Bloomberg. And while the focus is, of course, the Gulf economy, the Qatari Prime Minister was asked inevitably about his role in negotiating a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. Christine, of course, Saudi's got a really important role in those negotiations as well. So even though this meeting, this summit in Riyadh is focused on trade and investment, do you think the reality is those diplomatic conversations between the UK and Saudi about Israel-Hamas will be happening in the background as well?
It's really hard to say. My gut tells me no, I don't think so, because we don't have, as far as I can tell, on the ground here, any representation from the foreign ministry, for example, on the Saudi side of things. We really, the ministers that are here from a Saudi perspective are the tourism minister, the investment minister, the commerce minister. So I think it would be hard to have some of those conversations without some of those other key figures here. Now, it needs to be said, maybe they're floating around and I'm just not aware of it. But I think that those conversations may be reserved for a different kind of summit, because it really does look like who is here on the ground is really, it's a business delegation, all about trade, all about business, and about investment, really.
Yeah, and on that point, I think you pointed to it, but it's perhaps less understood in the UK that the 2030 vision, Saudi's economic blueprint, is also very focused, or is increasingly focused now, on bringing companies into Riyadh, as you said, wanting regional headquarters in Riyadh. I mean, on the pure trade front, is the UK, going to be able to extract out of these talks and the beginning of this relationship enough investment flow back into Britain? That's also perhaps the calculation that the UK is trying to make.
Yeah, because Christine, we often talk about, the oil price and how it's affected that public investment fund in Saudi Arabia. Surely they need to keep their money for themselves.
Yeah, it's true. And we are seeing what we're kind of calling a reality check here on the ground for Saudi Arabia, just given that, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia is struggling with budget deficits at the moment. It needs a much higher oil price than what we're seeing today in order to break even in terms of its budget. And the spending plans here on the ground are massive in order to meet all the deadlines for these mega projects, for all of the overhaul of the infrastructure happening in the capital city of Riyadh, for example, to get the city ready to cater to all of these tourists and to cater to all these new industries. I mean, the plan is so sweeping, it is so broad, that it just requires so much capital. And so we know on the ground here, there's been a bit of belt tightening, a bit of readjustment of, hey, look, what can we actually get done? So I do think it's really interesting to see a summit like this happening between the UK and Saudi Arabia, because you have to wonder, or you have to think that both sides are coming into this, yes, saying that this is a mutually beneficial event. And you know what? I'm sure it may be, but also both sides kind of want to extract money from the other. And so it will be interesting to see, does this lead to more investment from Saudi into the UK? I mean, I know there have been deals done, but as the PIF is focusing a bit more domestically, I do think there is a concern it's going to be doing less internationally. So I'm not sure. I think, again, I go back to this idea that, the UK companies come here, perhaps they win contract awards, for example, for some of these mega giga projects. There's no way in which that's a negative for the UK. And so maybe it'll just be a bit of that give and take. And ultimately there is an exchange, but I think it's just too early to tell. This event really looks like kind of a relationship building exercise, something that may be a breeding ground for that may allow us to kind of set the foundation for future deals, but perhaps not deals today.
Okay, Christine Burke, our Saudi Arabia Bureau Chief, we thank you for joining us from that summit in Riyadh. Caroline, those relationships are being built, but they might have to be built all over again if Labour wins the election later this year.
Yes, that's true, but I think Christine makes a very, very valid point. Despite the difficulties, the differences perhaps that the two countries have, Saudi Arabia cannot be ignored. It wants to kind of do a better job in terms of its global reputation. That is clearly a driver. But it also has this, frankly, astounding goal of diversifying its economy in short order by 2030. It's got such a young and dynamic population that it really, wants to be able to deliver much, much more. I think it's totally fascinating.
That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Walcock. Our audio engineer was Sean Grastamakia. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.